Hello, this is Nick Pellegrino from asileFX, and welcome to What's New in Vue 8 and 7.5. In this training, we're going to be taking a look at the new features of Vue 7.5 and the Vue features of Vue 8, how to use them, workflow-related changes, and trying to get you familiar with all of the modifications and get you started with all the new features as soon as possible. So I want to start out just by kind of quickly going over some of the main primary changes within the user's interface and just kind of some general things within the application. Now I just have a scene loaded in with just a procedural terrain. I'm going to go ahead and select this procedural terrain, and what we can see is a different color than the normal red selection color, and that's because we can now go up to File, Options, and under Display Options we can take a look and we can see Show Wireframe on Selected Objects and Highlight Parts Using Current Material. And both of these now have a color option. So we can change and have any selection color we want to overlay rather than just that static red color that was always part of the program. And if you go over to General Preferences, Interface Colors, you can also find the Selection Wireframe Color and Wireframe Highlight Colors within that interface menu as well. You'll also see a gradient background option. So if you want to have a nice fade and gradient in the interface, looks a little bit nicer, you can turn that on. If you import any old interface features, it will not have the gradient background option on. You'll have to manually turn that on. And also some of the new options, which have to do with viewing rigged meshes, and then of course the selection wireframe highlight colors will need to be modified. I also want to note that changes you make by importing that might change the selection wireframe could possibly overwrite the ones directly within the interface and within the display options. And Vue 8 also supports the Shader 4 model for video cards. So if you are using a newer video card, or at least made within the last couple of years, you should have support for Shader 4, and by default that should be on automatically. If not, turn it on. If your video card is compatible, it should work. I do want to make a note, the possibility of video memory being incorrect. And if you are a Windows user, specifically Windows XP, because I'm still running Windows XP x64, because I never liked Vista, and it did cause a lot of problems. A folder we can access is the config folder, and this is located under the application data for Eon software, and I'm in my Vue 8 xStream, if you're using Infinite, you can go to the Infinite folder, and under config there is a config file that you can open with even just Notepad, or actually that would be technically the environment, sorry. Open the environment XML file, and what we're going to find is a property name, video memory, type, and the value. Now this could just be a pre-release. Hopefully they're going to be fixing this, but if you do run into any weird issues where you're just having a very large lag, you do want to check this file and make sure that it is set to your video memory. I've got mine set a little lower than my actual video memory just for now because of the version I'm working with. Actually, it should be around 1500. But you can just set that to the memory amount and the RAM on your video card, and then it'll get rid of the default value, which sometimes is 128 and not correct. So that could be pretty important. With this procedural terrain selected, and if you have the gizmos on, display gizmos, show gizmos, one thing you may or may not have noticed is that the size gizmo has changed. It used to have little squares on the end, now it's arrows. A little confusing, it can be, because before it was an obvious block at the end which let you know you're using the size gizmo. So just pay attention to that because it has changed to an arrow and a direction now rather than more of a symbol representing the size tool. And I'm going to go ahead, switch this to the move gizmo really quick, zoom out, and one change that has been made is to the master object addition mode. So in order to access this option, we're going to copy and paste this terrain, Control-C, Control-V. I'm going to move it off to the side. And if we go over to the Library tab, and in this case, it does not look like the master object is showing up. We're going to see if we can get that to work. And it doesn't look like at the moment that was. So we'll do this with the standard terrain. Now we can see that terrain in here as a master object. So we select it, and we can go ahead and now modify them together. This was exactly how it was before. Local will independently modify these. But one change that has been made is if we select the master object and go down to the bottom and use the master object addition mode, it will now add a new object, proxy object, to work with. And this way we can work a little bit differently with these master objects and get a little bit of a better preview by working with this proxy. So in this case, it's kind of centered in between the terrains, and we can modify all of these objects, anything that's part of the master and linked to it. So that's kind of a cool change. Now, if we move away from this tab, it is going to delete that proxy. So it's no longer editable unless we go back, and we would have to enable the addition mode again. Pretty straightforward. It has changed for ecosystem as well, because the ecosystem population will show up. So really quickly, I'm going to create a standard terrain. We'll go ahead and load in just a grass texture, and add in ecosystem layer, add a plant. Let's go ahead and select just a maple tree. A nice fast rendering, fast populating plant. Go ahead and increase our density. Now this is only available when you have a static population. Clicking populate, it will not work with dynamic population, so just as it was before. But one change that has been made is if I select this maple tree, well, we can still go and edit, and it is going to make changes. Once we do, either way, if we're using the master object addition mode, it's going to create a proxy. And in previous versions, you could move away from the library tab and still have that proxy object as a non-rendering object to be able to manipulate, come back, and change all the instances. Well, now, once you get out of that library tab, it will delete the proxy. So that is one thing to keep in mind. If you're not familiar with this, what you can do is actually edit the object, make changes, go ahead and gnarl it, increase the length, click OK. It's going to update the ecosystem population and repopulate the ecosystem based on the changes made to that plant or any of the vegetation within the ecosystem, or pretty much anything within the ecosystem population that's not dynamically populated. So now we'll move away, and we can see that our proxy object no longer remains in the scene. So that's one change that has been made to the way the master objects and population editing works. So if we take a look now at some of the render options, one change that has been made is you can now render in any viewport full screen. In previous versions, if you had the top viewport open full screen and you went to show or do a preview render, it would knock the render back to the viewport mode for viewports, and the full screen option would only work with the main camera view. Well, now it works with all the viewports. So this is an awesome change to the program because it allows us to preview terrains a little bit larger, and because the main camera and other cameras within View are based on a focal length and not an actual top view where there is no distortion based on lens features or anything like that. Even when you're using a 50mm lens, which should be pretty fixed, you still have problems with the shapes and perspective being part of it. So now we could render, I mean, it is still limited to, of course, the size of your monitor, but it does open up some new possibilities. So this becomes a really great way to preview clouds, for instance, within another viewport. So really depending on the way the atmosphere is set up, you can see the cloud layer from the side, now full view rather than it being fixed to that viewport size in the 4 viewport mode. So that is a nice little change. Nothing's extremely special, but it does add a little bit more. And since we've already got a cloud layer in the scene, let's go ahead and take the main camera and pull it up just above those clouds. And let's go ahead and replace that ground material with something more interesting. We'll just make it match the terrain. Ignore the alpha information. And we're going to be able to see just those clouds loaded in as of version 7.5. And I'm going to go ahead and switch to just the final mode. And that'll open up the multipass G-buffer. I'm going to enable the multipass. And I'm going to use the internal renderer, render to screen. We'll just make a slightly larger render. We'll do 1280 by 960 in a 4:3 mode. And if we click Edit for the multipass, we're now going to see a cloud mask option available. So let's go ahead and check that on. So just using that cloud mask. I also want to note, if you're trying this yourself, make sure that in the render options you check to hide infinite planes from the render, or you won't see anything different showing up. So I'm going to go ahead and let this finish. So now we can take a look at the render, and I just want to show this full screen, so I'm going to close this out really quick and then click on our display last color render to open up the render. And if we take a look at the G pull down, which is for the G buffer multipass, we can see cloud mask. So a new feature that's been added is the ability to render out cloud masks. I do want to note that this is going to be all cloud layers combined into one specific mask. It does not break up individual cloud layers. It will do all of them in one pass. If you are interested in learning how to break them up a little more besides just turning off individual layers and re-rendering, I did do a training products, the matte painting and compositing series, and there is a section that covers how to create Z-depth for clouds and also how to create your own masks. So there is a little more training for that if you're interested. And if I move up here to the top where we have these arrows and we can change through the different layers, we can also see the color cloud layer kind of mixed with the alpha and the mask, which is producing a lot of artifacts with this preview. But another feature that was added in 7.5 is the ability to save out these individual passes, where before, if you were viewing a multipass G-buffer, you were not able to save. So now if you render to screen, you can go through these different passes, any of the available options, and save out the file. And I'm going to go to save really quick. And one thing I want to note is we have a new options button over here when we go to save anything. And so now defining, like if we select a JPEG, changing the quality of the compression would be selected in the options, and saving the file name and then clicking OK will not show a pop-up with those options. You do have to set it before you click save. And that's really important for especially saving out an EXR format, which will by default use alpha, which basically outputs a lot of the renders as just white, especially if you're trying to save Z-depth. So that's pretty important to pay attention to, and that will happen whenever you need to save any file. Now you change those settings within the options. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. And if we go to the render options, slight change within the main interface, and if we are using the external render, we now can choose Hyperview if we want to use it directly within the render options and not just clicking Edit first and then setting your options. So now you can do it directly within the interface. There is also an option to autosave based on minutes, which will save the render once it reaches a certain point. So if you're rendering something that's going to take, say, 5 hours, it will save an update every, in this case, the default every 30 minutes. This is probably an option you're not going to be using very frequently. I would also like to note that the preset render qualities have changed. Some of the settings have been modified between different presets, and the internal quality settings for all of the different modes. Probably one of the biggest changes you're going to see is the broadcast mode now having texture filtering on automatically. In order to see the changes, what you can do is use user setting and click load render settings. This is going to open up your environment folder, and this folder is located within the installation of Vue. And what you're going to be able to do is load in the presets from version 7 and also the ones that do not have -Vue 7 after it are the new Vue 8 presets. So if we go ahead and load in broadcast and click edit for the anti-aliasing, we will see that texture filtering has been enabled to a value of 33%, which was always the suggested value that Eon said you should use in order to prevent flickering based on textures. So this is probably an option that you wouldn't want to have on when you're rendering stills, because it will essentially blur all the textures in the scene. You may also notice that you can no longer select and change that texture filtering unless you're using the user setting. Previously, what you'd be able to do is choose a preset and click edit for the anti-aliasing and then change that texture filtering, and it was the only option that was really available. Well, now it's something that can't be edited, and it's just like the rest of the buttons that are grayed out. So if you want to make a closer comparison, you can load in the old settings, check out the new ones, see the differences, although I will note that most of the time the texture filtering stays the same and doesn't change between presets. But if you do have, and especially if you're rendering a still with an ecosystem, and by default that wind and breeze, basically the breeze option is on, which will cause movement on the plants, and if texture filtering is on, it could potentially blur them, and if you're trying to render a still, that could be a problem. Most of the time when I'm rendering stills, I never have the breeze on because it's really kind of pointless, and it also manipulates the way the scene looks, and if you're trying to render a still, you want it to look like it looks in the OpenGL and have a better idea. You don't want everything moving around on you. And we're just going to take a look at one last feature and a change that was made in Vue 7.5. I'm just going to create a new scene and go ahead and add in an atmosphere. And we'll just select a cloud layer, add in the small cumulus. One change that has been made, besides what we're seeing the OpenGL now rendering out the clouds, which is available file options and under OpenGL Atmosphere Preview, Preview Clouds, also planets, lens flares, things like that. But now being able to preview the clouds renders very quickly, provided your video memory is set correctly. And this will continue to render and kind of update throughout the scene. If you need to, you can refresh the sky. But that's not the feature I'm going to show you. Although this was available in 7.5, it has been improved in 8. The option I want to show you is spherical rendering, feature added in 7.5 and also available, of course, in Vue 8. And that is now the accurate spherical render. Before, the spherical render was not something that could be used as a spherical map for HDRI, similar mapping modes. If we want to, let's say, render the scene out to be an HDRI or an environment mapped image for the scene, first what we need to do is make sure the camera is level. So we're going to set the pitch to 90. And that's the most important one. Roll, of course, should be 0, because if we're starting to bank the camera, that's going to cause some issues. Keeping the camera level will automatically prevent that from happening, but if I start to tilt the camera, as we can see in the main camera preview, if we take a look, it's going to create this wavy horizon. So you need to make sure that roll is set to 0, pitch is set to 90, and that yaw doesn't really matter because it's the heading of the pitch or the heading of the camera around the scene, and that's just going to change the overall direction. If you want, you can set it to 180. After you do render, I do want to note that the environment map position will be slightly different because of this heading direction. Really, the easiest thing to do is just select the sunlight if you have point at camera turned on, and then position it over the background HDRI image and line it up. And that's really one of the easiest ways. But if you need to preserve the sun in the exact position, you will need to set the camera to render specifically to the alignment of the environment map. And that could take a little bit of tweaking just because the distortion of the image and the way a spherical render is laid out, the fact that we're really seeing more of the horizon in a smaller part of the picture than the way it's mapped to the scene, the light might not work correctly anyway. So there might not be, and there really isn't, any specific yaw you can use to get an exact match always. You're pretty much always going to have to grab that light and match it up. But let's just take a look at this render. We'll just do something fairly small to take a look. And we're going to see a huge change. The main camera preview is not going to show what is actually going to come out of the render. But now, as we can start to render, we're going to see already cloud stretching around the top because it's going to be an accurate spherical map. So I'm going to let this just finish out, and we can take a look at the final version. And now with the finished render, you can see the clouds starting to distort around the top, and a lot more accurate as we move towards the horizon. And this is now a completely accurate spherical map, whereas before it was just a more advanced, more open panoramic render. So really quick, even though this is such a low quality, I'm going to go ahead and save this out. And I'm going to use the EXR format, turn off the alpha, just call this sky, I'm going into my default folder, which I rarely ever use. And now we can see one of the other options or panels that comes up, which has to do with saving 32-bit images and using the natural film response and post-processing options, which are not 32-bit processes. Exposure, things like that are, but natural film response is not. So I'm going to click yes and disable those options for this render to save out correctly. Otherwise it's going to cause some extra distortion. So let's go to the atmosphere editor, click on environment mapping, go ahead and turn off the fog and haze, go to effects, and we can load in that image. And I also want to note that if you are saving different types of files or different types of images, the alpha, the color, and the Z, you still do have to individually select the folder initially, and then it will remember, but otherwise it's going to send you to the default pictures folder, and then you have to navigate away from it. But that does, of course, save with the scene those choices, so that is pretty nice. And yes, I'll select for the image-based lighting to automatically set it up. And I'm going to turn off panoramic, and that will automatically turn off the spherical render. So now what I was talking about with the sun before, I want to make sure that we just turn point on camera on, and what we can do is just move the sun into position. And if you remembered exactly where it was before, basically I'm just going to look at the lighting and try to find the center, and it would be somewhere around in here. Don't have an exact match, but because of that distortion, which you can clearly see once we start looking all the way up, you can see a little bit of stretching. The pitch and angle won't remain the same regardless, so sometimes you just need to kind of position that and do it manually. Now, because it's such a low quality image, it does look terrible, but still that spherical rendering works pretty well. But this spherical rendering ends up becoming a different solution than using the File and Export Sky option, which has been a one-core render for quite some time. Those are the major changes, besides a few additional previews that you may notice. One being, if we were to just first create a new scene, metaclouds are now a little bit of a better preview in the OpenGL. So if you've used the metaclouds, you'll be able to see something that looks a little bit better as a preview. It doesn't really change when you scale or make modifications to the material. This is just kind of a basic volumetric shader that's applied, but it does become a pretty nice preview.